Hello, everyone, and welcome to this term's third retro seminar. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm an international research fellow at the Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation and associate professor at Esade Business School. With me today is Alan Morrison, who is professor of law and finance at the Said Business School in Oxford and co-convenes retro with me, and our guest speaker, Brian Berkey. Brian is an associate professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He's an expert on moral and political philosophy, including business ethics and environmental ethics, and he's published very interesting work on topics like effective altruism, animal ethics, and the demandingness of morality. More recently, he's been working on questions related to autonomous vehicles, partner hiring in academia, the moral distinctiveness of terrorism, and exploitation, of course, which is the focus of today's seminar. More on that in a second. Now, Brian has done way too much service to the academic community for me to cover in this short introduction, but let me briefly mention his roles as associate editor for the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy, area editor for Ergo and Philosophy as a Way of Life Commons, and editorial board member for Business Ethics Quarterly. He's also co-organizer of the Zicklin Normative Business Ethics Workshop Series, which is a very precious opportunity for scholars to test ideas and to connect to some of the most brilliant minds in the field. Brian, thanks so much for this service to our community. Now, we're absolutely thrilled to have Brian with us today, and I will hand over to him shortly. But before I do that, let me say a few quick words about the seminar. As usual, many of you are regular attendees, and so you've heard most of this before. I'm really sorry for the repetition, but for those of you who are here for the first time, this might actually be useful. So Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust, and Relationships at Oxford, is an online seminar series that is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust, reputation, and other forms of social evaluation in organizational life. Retro attracts a wonderfully diverse audience whom I'd like to thank for joining us today. And I'd also like to thank the people who make Retro possible. Rupert Younger, director of the CCR and very enthusiastic supporter of the series from day one. Hannah Morgan, Pippa Smeaton, and Mark Hughes Morgan, who do all of the essential backstage work to make these seminars happen. And of course, Alan, whose knowledge and wisdom have been crucial to the existence and success of this series. Now, exploitation is a term that we commonly use to characterize very different situations that can occur all in the context of economic activity of different types. We may use it, for example, when we talk about forced labor, or when we talk about aggressive sales tactics that take advantage of vulnerable individuals like socially isolated older adults. We may also use it when we talk about the testing of new and risky drugs in poor communities, or when we talk about sweatshop workers doing very long hours for very little pay in very unsafe conditions. Now, typically the assumption is that the exploited are unwilling parties to the relationship with the exploiter, and that some form of violence or manipulation is involved. In forced labor, the worker is compelled to work against their will through violence or threats of some sort, and the vulnerable person being sold a product or service that they don't need would most likely not buy it if they were fully aware of the facts. But there's an argument that some cases of exploitation actually leave the exploited better off than they were before. For example, the drug test subject may not be able to afford less risky treatment, and so the study may be their only chance of recovery or of making the money required to pay for such treatment. Similarly, the sweatshop worker may be there voluntarily because their only alternative is unemployment and complete destitution. So can we still say that there is a moral wrong in these cases? And if we do, can we consider that wrong to be justifiable, given that the exploited party is not worse off as a result of the exploitative behavior? And if we consider that wrong justifiable, does that open the door to the lowering of standards elsewhere? These are all questions that we need to understand and to answer properly if we want to be able to identify exploitation correctly, and perhaps more importantly, to prevent it from happening. And I think that these are questions that we will all be much better able to answer after we hear what Brian has to say. Now, Brian will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes as usual. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. Please enter them into the Q&A box, not the chat, and then either Alan or I will relay them to Brian. We're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. UK time. Brian, thank you again so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Rita, and thanks to both you and Alan for organizing the series and for inviting me to participate. It's really great to be here. Very much looking forward to the discussion. So Rita's description of some of the central issues that arise with respect to exploitation was really helpful. It kind of sets up what I'll talk about nicely. So uh, there's a kind of intuition that most of us, I think, have that cases in which people are employed in kind of poor conditions and work long hours for little pay involve wrongful exploitation, right? So these are sort of typical sweatshop cases. And the cases that are philosophically interesting, as Rita pointed out, are cases in which the workers choose to work in the sweatshops over whatever their kind of alternative options are because they view the sweatshop option as the best among a set of all quite poor options, right? Um, so philosophers who've thought about exploitation have tried to um, argue for various views about how to understand the wrong that might be involved in these cases in which we can't understand the wrong as a wrong of kind of force or coercion or harm or kind of these sort of other familiar categories of wrong. So the question is something like, well, is there a kind of distinctive wrong of exploitation in these kinds of cases in which the transactions between the employees and the employers are voluntary and mutually beneficial? So the first kind of view that a number of people have found appealing uh, involves claiming that the wrong consists in a kind of unfairness, right? So the idea is something like, uh, well, look, these transactions are voluntary and mutually beneficial, but the benefits disproportionately go to the less vulnerable party to the transaction. So the employers are kind of extracting a disproportionate share of the benefits and leaving an unfairly low share of the benefits of the transaction for, say, the sweatshop workers, right? Um, and there's something that's kind of intuitive about this. It sort of seems like a nice moral principle that kind of when parties are involved in kind of jointly producing benefits, there's some kind of principle of fairness that governs the distribution of those benefits. Uh, and it allows us to say that uh, those who are employed in sweatshops, for example, are the wronged parties, right? They're the ones who are denied their fair share of the benefits of the transactions. So that's kind of a natural view that a number of people at least start out kind of finding appealing in thinking about these kinds of cases. And it's defended fairly widely in the philosophical literature on exploitation. But there's a challenge to that sort of view that comes primarily from those who want to defend the permissibility of employing people in sweatshop conditions so long as the transaction between the employer and the employee is genuinely voluntary and genuinely beneficial to the employee in relation to their other options, right? So this challenge appeals to a claim that's come to be known as the nonworseness claim. And that claim says that it can't be wrong to engage in a voluntary and mutually beneficial transaction with a person so long as there's no independent obligation to do anything to benefit the person who is more vulnerable in the transaction, right? So, to take the example of sweatshops, right? The idea is if it's permissible, if there would be nothing wrong with the sweatshop employer just not hiring the workers at all, right? Then it's hard to see how it could be wrong to hire them on terms that they voluntarily agree to and that benefit them, right? They're made better off than they would be in the absence of being hired. And so if it would be okay, morally speaking, to not hire them, then it's hard to see how hiring them in a way that benefits them and that they agree to could be wronging them, right? In a way that we have reason to find objectionable for these sort of fairness-based reasons. Um, so when I started kind of thinking about these issues, I, on the one hand, started out, I think, like most people, with the intuition that there is something objectionable about employers employing people in sweatshop conditions, even when the transactions are voluntary and mutually beneficial. But this challenge that appeals to this claim that, well, look, most people think that it would be perfectly fine for these employers to not hire these workers at all, but they're at least made better off if they're hired. How could it be wrong to do something that's better for somebody than an alternative that is itself permissible? Um, I found that challenge difficult to kind of uh, to see how why we might think that challenge doesn't succeed. Right. One reason for finding the challenge difficult to ignore, difficult to dismiss, is that um, it seems to be focused in the right way on the interests of the people who are vulnerable enough that they would be willing to accept a sweatshop job, right? So it seems like we shouldn't want our account of the wrong of exploitation to be such that um, those who want to avoid wrongdoing have reason to do something that's worse for people who are already so badly off that they would be willing to accept a sweatshop job, right? So um, the fairness-based view looks like it kind of tells employers, well, look, if you want to avoid acting wrongly, better to just leave the potential sweatshop workers without the sweatshop job option, where by hypothesis they're worse off than giving them the option, in which case you're likely to end up exploiting them, right? Um, but despite finding this challenge coming from the non-worseness claim um, appealing in certain ways, uh, I'm not inclined to accept that there's just nothing wrong with employing people in sweatshops so long as it's voluntary and mutually beneficial. So what I've tried to do in kind of a series of papers in recent years is to kind of develop an account of the wrong of exploitation that, um, on the one hand, differs in important ways from the fairness-based view so that it is, I claim, kind of properly oriented toward the interests of people who are vulnerable to exploitation. Um, but at the same time, uh, doesn't allow that there's nothing wrong with employing people in sweatshops, at least in typical cases. So, how can we do this, right? It's a little puzzling at first to see how we might be able to develop this kind of view. So, to see how this can work, it's helpful to start with a case in which um, virtually everyone will accept that a voluntary and mutually beneficial transaction is wrongfully exploitative, even proponents of the non-worseness claim. So think about this sort of case. Imagine that um, I have one dose of a drug, and there's one person who needs a dose of the drug in order to survive, right? The drug will treat some condition that they have that would otherwise kill them, right? Um, and imagine that I got the drug for $10, right? It's not that expensive. but I'm the only potential source of the drug for the person who needs it. And so I've got all this bargaining power. So I tell the person, look, I'll give you this drug that you need in order to survive, but only if you sign a contract to give me, 90% of your income for the rest of your life, right? Everyone's going to agree that I am guilty of wrongful exploitation in that case. And the reason in this case is that I have an independent positive duty to uh, help the person in need, right? I'm morally obligated to give the person the drug for no more than a reasonable price. Maybe I can charge $10 or $15 or something like that. But um, but it would be wrong of me to not offer the drug at a reasonable price to the person who needs it. I have a duty of rescue or something along those lines. So that in that case, proponents of the non-worseness claim can't appeal to the idea that, well, there's no independent obligation to help. And so by engaging in a voluntary and mutually beneficial transaction, you're doing something better than a permissible option because there is no kind of baseline permissible option in which I don't help, right? Um, so that kind of case highlights that um, first of all, even proponents of the non-worseness claim can't say and don't want to say typically that any voluntary and mutually beneficial transaction can avoid the charge of wrongful exploitation. Um, but in typical sweatshop cases, it does seem to most people that there's no independent positive duty that is owed to the sweatshop workers, the workers who are in fact hired, um, that can kind of explain why that case might be analyzable in the same way as the case that I just described involving me and the drug. Now, in order to see how we might be able to do this, it's helpful to consider an alternative version of the drug case that looks more like typical sweatshop employment cases. So here's a variant of the drug case. So imagine again, I have one dose of the drug, but instead of there being just one person who needs the drug in order to survive, now imagine there are 10 people who need a dose of the drug in order to survive. There's no one other than me who has a dose, but I only have one, right? So no matter what I do, I'm not going to be able to help everyone, right? Um, but it does seem like I'm obligated to help someone, right? It would be wrong to waste the drug, and it would still be wrong to insist on getting 90% of someone's income for the rest of their life in exchange for the drug. So, if all of that is right, then in this case, what we have is a positive duty that I owe not to any particular person in the group of 10, but in some sense to all of them, right? But what I owe to each of them is not to provide them with the drug at a reasonable price because I can't provide each of them with the drug at a reasonable price. So what I owe to each of them is to provide one of them with the drug at a reasonable price. Right? So what we see from this case, I think, that's really important is that when there is a group of people who are all in need, and I have limited resources that are available to help a subset of that group, I can owe an obligation to each member of the group where the content of that obligation is to help an appropriate subset of the group. So to put it in uh, terms that kind of refer to particular people that might kind of help to see what I have in mind here. Imagine that the group of 10 includes, person A, person B, person C, person D, person E, and so on, right? Um, what I owe to each of them is to provide the drug to one of them at a reasonable price. So the thought is that I discharge my obligation to person B and to person C and to person D, even if those people don't get the drug and end up dying, right? And I give the drug to person A, right? So that seems to me to be the most plausible way of understanding both the content of my obligation in this case and to whom I owe the relevant duties, right? Prior to the time that I've decided that it's A that's going to get the drug, I have an obligation to all of them. I would wrong each of them by either refusing to give the drug to anyone or um, exploiting one of them, right, by, say, insisting on getting 90% of their income in exchange for the drug. Right? So my suggestion is that we should understand exploitation in sweatshop cases uh, in a way that's parallel to the way that I've suggested that we understand my obligation in the case involving the drug. So, proponents of the non-worseness claim have tended to argue that, well, look, sweatshop employers didn't owe it to the particular workers who they hired to hire them at all. And so, if the non-worseness claim is right, then those workers can't be wronged by uh, the employment practices of sweatshops that engage in genuinely voluntary and mutually beneficial transactions. Because the non-worseness claim says that if you don't owe a positive duty to the particular people with whom you transact, right, then it can't be wrong to transact with them on um, terms that seem on reflection exploitative, right? Um, but my drug case involving 10 people in need shows that that claim is mistaken, right? Because when I give the drug to A, I didn't owe it to A to transact with her, right? Um, but nonetheless, clearly I had an independent positive duty to help someone within the group of 10 people in need, and to do so in a non-exploitative way. So I can't say after um, extracting 90% of A's income through this transaction that I couldn't have done anything wrong because I didn't owe it to A in particular to transact with her on fair terms. Right? So in the sweatshop case, um, while it's true that employers don't have an obligation to benefit any particular worker that they hire, my claim is in a world um, that looks like ours, in which there's kind of massive global poverty, inequality, lack of opportunities, and on the other hand, multinational corporations that have vast resources, some of which could pretty easily be deployed in ways that improve working conditions, pay, hours, and so on for um, people who are among the world's uh, worst off people, it's plausible, it's highly plausible that those multinational corporations have some positive duties to benefit people who are vulnerable to exploitation, who are badly off enough that they would be willing to accept a sweatshop job. And if I'm right about the drug case, then it doesn't matter that uh, firms that employ people in sweatshop conditions weren't obligated to benefit the particular people who they in fact hire, but instead we can point to the fact that they have a positive duty to benefit some appropriate subset of the people who are badly off enough that they would be willing to accept a sweatshop job, in order to claim that they are guilty of wrongful exploitation for the same kinds of reasons that I would be guilty of wrongful exploitation by extracting 90% of somebody's income in exchange for the drug, right? Um, so on this sort of view, sweatshop employers wrong not only the workers who they in fact employ, but everyone in the class of potential employees who would be willing to accept a sweatshop job, right? The content of their duty is to provide some amount of benefit to a subset of the people in that larger group without extracting an inappropriately large share of the benefits of their joint activity, right? And so by employing some people on sweatshop terms, they violate a duty that's owed to a much broader class of people who are vulnerable to exploitation. And one thing that means is that the way that we have to understand the wrong of exploitation is not in terms of any kind of unfairness specifically to the people who are actually employed, but instead in terms of the employer extracting an unfair share or a disproportionately large share of the benefits of their set of economic transactions more broadly, when those benefits ought to have been dispersed in some appropriate way among the whole group of people who were vulnerable to being exploited in the relevant ways. So one advantage of this kind of view that I'm defending is that, like the view that results from accepting the kind of standard version of the non-worseness claim, it seems appropriately oriented toward the interests of people who are vulnerable to exploitation, right? We don't get this puzzling result that you get from the fairness-based views, um, according to which it can be morally better to adopt policies that leave people who are badly off and vulnerable worse off than they would be if you engaged in a voluntary and mutually beneficial transaction. It's the positive duty that I claim kind of underlies the wrong of exploitation that guarantees that the moral view about the wrong that I'm defending um, doesn't permit uh, refraining from doing anything to benefit a subset of the group of people in need, right? And this is really important because it seems like our concern about exploitation really should be grounded in a more general concern for the interests of the people who are vulnerable to exploitation. So, proponents of the fairness-based view tend to think, for example, that firms that just keep jobs in rich countries and do absolutely nothing to benefit people who are badly off around the world and would be willing to accept a sweatshop job are not doing anything wrong. It's like perfectly fine for firms to just concentrate the benefits of employment opportunities in rich countries where the laws might prevent any employment arrangement from being so bad that it would constitute wrongful exploitation of the kind that exists in sweatshops. But it seems to me that we shouldn't be inclined to accept a view that tells decision makers at firms that it's morally better to just ignore the plight of people who are vulnerable and badly off enough that they'd be willing to accept sweatshop jobs. And in particular, wrong to transact with them in ways that really would benefit them, but fail to meet some standard of transactional fairness. Instead, I think once we accept that these firms have a positive duty to contribute to improving the situation of at least a subset of the people who are badly off enough that they'd be willing to accept sweatshop jobs, the account of the wrong of exploitation doesn't imply that it would be acceptable uh, for firms to just ignore those people who are particularly badly off. So disengagement is not a morally permissible option in the way that it generally is for proponents of the fairness-based views. Right? Another advantage of the sort of view that I am defending is that it allows us to capture a way in which firms that employ people in sweatshop conditions um, really do exploit those who would accept the jobs but are not chosen for them, right? And to see this, all that's required is kind of thinking about how these kinds of labor markets work, right? When there is a very large supply of labor, that is, of individuals who would be willing to accept these kinds of jobs, right? Firms are able to employ the people that they do hire, and pay them less than they would have to pay them if the supply of labor were lower, right? And so firms really do count on the existence of a large pool of potential laborers in order to extract as much benefit from the transactions that they engage in with a subset from that pool as they are in fact able to extract. Right? And what that means is that there's a very clear sense in which those firms are using, that is, exploiting the fact that there is a very large number of badly off people who would be willing to accept those jobs in the course of extracting as much value from the transactions that they in fact engage in as they do. And so, uh, on my view, we can say that firms are not only wronging those who they actually hire and who end up working in poor conditions for low wages and working long hours and so on. But they exploit everyone in the pool of potential workers who would have accepted those jobs. And so the wrong of exploitation is not a kind of narrowly directed wrong, that is a wrong committed only against the parties to the transactions. Instead, it's a wrong committed against a larger pool of people, just as my wrong against the 10 people who um, need the drug in order to survive is a wrong against the entire group of people in need, even though I only transact with one of them. Right? Um, this sort of view, it seems to me, captures in a way that no other view that has been defended can, the way in which we should want our account of the wrong of exploitation to be compatible with um, the sort of broader concern about kind of global poverty, inequality, suffering, lack of opportunity that makes concern about exploitation especially appropriate, right? we should want our view about the wrong of exploitation to be connected in the right sort of way to the commitments that we have about um, the importance of kind of relieving poverty and suffering and lack of opportunities and these other kinds of things. And I think the fairness-based views and other kinds of views that require that the wrong be understood as a kind of narrowly directed wrong can't do that. All right, I'll end there and open things up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. That was absolutely fascinating. My brain is just going a million miles an hour now. I just wanted to remind people to please use the Q&A function for their questions and comments. We seem to be dealing with a slight technical problem because many of you appear with the same name. If you are one of the people who has been rebaptized as our wonderful colleague who helped us to prepare these Zoom meetings, please remember to type your name at the end of your question so that we know who you are. Sorry for the glitch. Okay, I will while people type their questions and comments, I will abuse my role and ask my own questions. I have a million of them, and I'm not sure how many of them stem from potential slight misunderstandings of what you just presented. So I'll start with the one that I think is the most likely to come out of misunderstanding. So at one point, you spoke specifically about these duties being attributed to multinational corporations that have vast resources, etc. But then I was a little confused as to who you were actually speaking about. Is it the sweatshop, which is a distinct legal entity and morally speaking, probably also a distinct entity, depending on the case and your position on corporate moral agency? But then whose obligation is it?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I didn't clarify this in the talk. Um, it's widely acknowledged in these debates, although usually just in like footnotes that say, I'm just going to kind of paper over, this distinction for the sake of clarity in the discussion. But it's widely acknowledged that a lot of sweatshops in the actual world are kind of operated by local firms that actually don't have a ton of resources. Um, they operate on kind of slim profit margins and so on. The reason that they are under pressure to do that is that typically big multinational firms are kind of insisting that they provide a large volume of products at a very low price. And so it's pressure from the multinational firms that leads to the local firms basically having no choice but to um, employ workers for low wages and long hours and in poor conditions and so on. And so my view is that at least typically it's the multinational firms that are guilty of the wrong of exploitation and that have these sort of positive duties that they could quite easily satisfy by paying a bit more for the products or um, uh, requiring less volume, for each interval of time, or some combination of these kinds of things. In fact, I think their duties are stronger than that. I think they have obligations to do things like monitor in a reasonable way the kind of conditions that their suppliers are subjecting workers to and allowing that they might have to, pay more for the products and, do these other kinds of things in order to ensure that the workers are treated reasonably well. So to my mind, the fact that, these transactions, kind of occur across a number of entities doesn't by itself make very much of a moral difference, right? The question is just which agents are capable and have the resources necessary to make it the case that the workers who might be directly employed by, a small local firm in a poor country, are not treated in the ways that constitute wrongful exploitation.
I have like 5 follow-ups. We're running low on time and we have questions coming in from the audience. So maybe I'll just give Alan his turn and I'll talk to you later. Okay,
Thank you. So Rita just shot one of my foxes, which means I have the same follow-up questions, but I'll try something different. I had 2 related points, one of which is almost the same as Holger Blenska's question. So one concerned one question was whether actually the non-worseness condition can be salvaged in the case of 10 people with 1 dose. So with 1 person on 1 dose, clearly I have an obligation to help that 1 person. If there are 10 people, presumably I'm going to ask you, is there some metric I should use? There is a procedure that happens to find someone. So perhaps I have a perfect utility machine and it tells me which person is most deserving, in which case I have an obligation to that person. And we're back with the non-worseness condition. And I have a positive obligation, which prevents me from ripping them off. And I don't have an obligation to anyone else because they will lose the competition. So that was one question. The other, which I think you probably answered towards the end of your talk, but it's very closely related. In order to take the 10 per people 1 dose across to the employer, if I have a dose of a medicine that will save a life, clearly I have an obligation to give it to someone. Does an employer have an obligation to hire someone? Because in order for your argument to work, I think I have to have that obligation. And I'm not sure how you make. I mean, I can see that I might have such an obligation, but I don't see how it fits in necessarily with your theory.
Yeah, great. So on the first question about whether in certain versions of the 1 dose of drug, 10 people in need case, there might be an obligation to a specific person. I think there can be, but all I need to kind of make the point that I want to make using that case is that there can be some instances of cases of that kind in which there isn't an obligation to a specific person. So, imagine that the utility machine says, all 10 of them are equally deserving, right? Then it seems like, I mean, maybe I should flip a coin, you roll a 10-sided die or something like that. But again, in that sort of case, I don't have an obligation, at least at the outset, to one specific person. It's a case where, as I want to say, I owe it to each of them to help them. And the mere possibility of cases like that, I think, shows that the standard way that proponents of the non-worseness claim argue in favor of the permissibility of sweatshop employment fails, right? So on the second question, sorry, remind me quickly.
I have an obligation to employ someone.
Yes.
It's only at that point that your drug example works.
Yes. So that is a somewhat controversial feature of my kind of overall view. So I do think that agents who are capable of providing significant economic benefits to people in need, in general, have at least some obligation to do that. And for firms, one of the most obvious ways of satisfying that obligation is by employing people, right? So I do think that at least some firms have obligations that, maybe it's not true that they can only be satisfied by hiring people, but hiring people is going to be one of the more obvious ways of satisfying obligations of capable agents to provide economic benefits to people in need, right? One way to think about this is, it's sort of plausible to think that, especially in a society in which many people are badly off and we kind of need economic activity to produce the resources that can improve people's lives, that many of us as individuals have at least some obligation to make productive contributions, right? Um, and if that's right, then I think there's no way around thinking that, at least if we're going to treat firms as agents capable of having obligations at all, that they can have similar kinds of obligations.
So we're back to our corporate moral agency question.
Right. I mean, I'm sort of assuming.
I'm willing to accept that. Yes, Rita, I'm taking up valuable airtime here. Rita.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a question from Mike Rogerson. Hi, Mike. Which also gives me a way in for one of the follow-up questions from earlier. So Mike is asking where we should draw the boundaries around firm responsibilities, because it sounded from what you were saying that maybe the firm has responsibilities for the people that it employs, but also for people that it doesn't employ, and therefore everyone. And I would like to add to Mike's question, in terms of the responsibilities or the duties that the firm might owe to the people who run the sweatshop. Because if I understood your earlier point correctly, and we're assuming that at least in the typical case, there is sort of an indirect causation of the exploitation, then it sounds to me that the firm is also potentially wronging the people who run the sweatshop by causing moral injury to them, by forcing them to apply conditions in their business that they know are not fair to the people that they employ.
Yeah, that's great. So I hadn't thought about the second part of your question. So that is whether we should think that multinational firms are also wronging like owners of sweatshops in poor countries. And yeah, I think the answer is probably in some cases they are, right? They are um, applying pressure on the owners of sweatshops to engage in employment practices that are wronging the employees and a larger group of people, the entire group of potential employees on my account. And I think there is reason to think that applying pressure on someone that leads them to engage in conduct that either is morally wrong or kind of would be morally wrong for that agent to do if they weren't under all of that pressure, is a way of wronging someone. So yeah, I am inclined to think that multinational firms are, at least in many cases, wronging sweatshop owners also. On the question about the boundary, where to draw the line in terms of firm obligations, my general view is that there isn't a line that kind of demarcates to whom firms can have obligations of the relevant kind, right? So, I know like within business ethics, there's some people who accept like versions of stakeholder theory on which, we kind of understand who the stakeholders are in a relatively narrow way, right? So, employees and suppliers and local communities, but not like everyone in the world. And I just think that's a mistake. I think any view that narrows the range of people or sentient beings to whom a firm can have obligations is just unavoidably going to generate deeply unacceptable implications, because kind of any view that implies that we can ignore the rights or interests of some people or sentient beings who are otherwise, who otherwise kind of have moral status, is just going to end up permitting conduct that we have good reason to think is unacceptable. So I think any attempt to say, well, look, if you're making decisions on behalf of a firm, we can kind of set the boundaries such that you only have obligations to the people who kind of fall within the boundary is mistaken. We can't accept any view like that.
Oh, okay, sorry. Alan, you go.
So we have a bunch of really interesting questions in the Q&A. And I'm struggling to find one that we can do in 6 minutes. David Silver's got a great answer to my second question, to your answer to my second question. But I think I'm going to have to send you that after the seminar because it can take a while to respond to it. Robert Mass has a short question, which I think is interesting and that I think you could probably extend a bit. So his question just says, if my choice as an employer is to hire 50 people and pay them sweatshop wages, or 25 persons and pay them twice as much, what's the moral thing to do? I actually wonder if you end up with something like the repugnant conclusion here.
Excellent. Yeah, this is a really good question, and this is a really challenging issue for the sort of view that I'm defending, because I think I am under a great deal of theoretical pressure to say, look, in principle, it might be the case that you ought to hire the 50 people at the sweatshop wages as opposed to a smaller number of people at higher wages. And I actually think that's the right answer, right? So a lot of people are going to disagree with that, but the way that I would defend it is by saying something like this. Firms making these kinds of decisions are, even if it's not the only thing they're doing, one of the things they're doing is that they're making a decision about how certain benefits are going to be distributed, right? So, there's some amount of benefit in the aggregate that's going to be distributed among the people whom they hire for these jobs. And in effect, this choice is a choice between distributing that amount of benefit relatively narrowly among kind of a smaller group of people, but where each person will get a greater share of the benefits, or distributing those benefits more broadly among a larger group of people where each person will get a smaller share of the benefit, right? Well, normally, when we are making decisions like that, we do think that it's better to distribute the benefits more broadly, even if each person gets a smaller share, right? So, if I have $10,000 to distribute in bonuses among people in my department who are all kind of equally deserving, right? And there are 10 of them, right? It sort of seems like the default distribution that we should prefer is an equal one where everybody gets some share, even though that share is going to be smaller, right? It seems like I shouldn't pick two people and just give half of the pot of money to to those two people. I grant that with choosing who to employ and how many people to employ, there are kind of factors that are relevant that go beyond what's relevant in these sort of purely allocative decisions. But I think that the factors that make it the case that in general we prefer to distribute benefits more broadly in the purely allocative decisions still apply in the employment choices. And so I think we do end up with a view on which it's better for employers to hire more people insofar as that will disperse the relevant benefits to more of the people who are badly off enough that those benefits are really important to them. And the other thing to say about that is it makes it the case, as I mentioned briefly in the talk, that, the wrong of exploitation is fundamentally a wrong that consists in the employer, or really, to go back to my answer to the earlier question, the multinational firm, extracting a disproportionately large share of the benefits for itself, and not so much about whether any particular person who's exploited is getting a particular share of the benefits, right? So, so long as the employer is limiting its own gains in an acceptable way, then they're not guilty of wrongful exploitation. And then it's kind of a further question whether there's reason to prefer that the benefits that are going to the employees go to, say, a smaller number of them where each of them gets more, or a larger number where each of them gets less.
Rita, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, I really wanted to ask another question. This is a fascinating topic, and thank you so much, Brian. This has been a very thought-provoking and very, very interesting talk. Thank you also to everyone who put their questions and comments in the chat. Sorry again for the technical glitch, and sorry that we couldn't get to more of your questions, but as usual, we will send all of them to Brian afterwards so that he can at least think about them. I also want to use up these last few seconds of airtime that we have to advertise the next and last retro seminar of this term. It'll take place on the 6th of March, and we're going to welcome Tanushree Jain, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Management, Society and Communication at Copenhagen Business School. And she will be giving a talk titled Unpacking the Status of Token Women in Corporate Boardrooms. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating as well, I'm sure. And you can find the registration link in the Retro website and all the usual places. So please do register, and we hope to see many of you then again. So thanks, Brian, again so much, and thank you all.